When you hand your credit card across the front desk of a world-famous hotel or a prestigious hospital, you naturally assume that massive, multi-billion-dollar brand is securing your data. But that trust relies entirely on a corporate illusion. Legally speaking, the logo on the building is often a complete ghost. The entity physically collecting and taking legal responsibility for your personal information is rarely the global umbrella brand whose name lights up the skyline. To understand how companies get away with this, we have to look at the legal architecture they operate under. Under India's older Information Technology Act of 2000, companies acted as legal shapeshifters. They used fluid classifications, like acting as intermediaries, to pass the buck and dodge liability during a data breach. The government sought to eliminate that exact loophole. They drafted the new Digital Personal Data Protection Act, the DPDPA, to strip away that fluidity entirely, forcing undeniable lines of accountability. This split-screen diagram illustrates the change. On the left, you see the morphing, evasive structure of the old law. On the right, the DPDPA introduces a strictly binary system. According to the text, an entity touching your data is locked into one of two boxes. You are either a data fiduciary, who declares the purpose, or a data processor, who simply follows orders. There is no middle ground. The intent was clear: prevent a corporate shell game where everyone points the finger at a subcontractor. However, while this strict binary looks great on paper, it is often incompatible with the complex, decentralized architecture of modern global business. To see where the law breaks down, we need to establish the exact legal threshold for becoming a fiduciary. Under the DPDPA, the absolute prerequisite is declaring the specific intention, or the purpose, for collecting the data. You do not collect data into a void. The physical act of taking someone's ID is inherently tied to a specific intention. Because of this, the law dictates that the fundamental purpose of collection cannot be split between two different entities. Whoever declares the purpose and takes the data holds the primary responsibility. The statute does allow for one slight structural variation: the joint data fiduciary. But joint status is strictly limited. It applies only when a second entity provides the overarching financial or technological means for the ecosystem to operate. They provide the infrastructure, but they do not decide the initial purpose of collection. Think of it like a high-end restaurant. The primary data fiduciary is the head chef. They design the menu, declare the purpose of the dish, and decide exactly what ingredients to source. The data processor is the line cook in the back. They strictly chop vegetables exactly how the chef instructed, holding zero creative or legal liability if the recipe itself causes harm. The joint fiduciary in this scenario is the restaurant's financial backer. They aren't in the kitchen chopping onions, and they didn't write the menu, but they provide the economic means for the kitchen to exist, so they share the structural responsibility. The logic here is rigid. If you do not declare the purpose of the data, and you do not provide the overarching means to process it, you hold zero fiduciary responsibility. This standard creates an opening for global brands to bypass accountability. Let's test those strict rules against the hospitality sector. Consider the massive franchise ecosystem of a brand like Radisson. When you book a room at the Atria Hotel operating under the Radisson Blu brand, the local Atria management physically takes your ID and swipes your credit card. Legally, because Atria declared the purpose of booking your room and collected the information, they are your primary data fiduciary. This creates a massive mismatch between legal reality and consumer trust. You handed over your card because you trust the Radisson brand. But if a data breach occurs, Radisson's corporate lawyers will point directly to the DPDPA. They will claim they are merely a licensing shell, completely removed from the physical collection of your data. But the technological reality contradicts that defense. Look at this network diagram. The overarching brand forces the franchisee to use mandated property management software. When the local node absorbs your information at the front desk, specific APIs ensure that data is instantly beamed back up to Radisson's massive centralized server hubs. Radisson then actively uses that raw data. It feeds their global loyalty programs, drives their centralized revenue tracking, and trains their global marketing algorithms. Despite engineering this highly efficient data extraction pipeline, the umbrella brand leverages the strict literal text of the DPDPA. They argue that providing a software template doesn't make them a joint fiduciary. allowing them to claim the status of an innocent third-party software vendor when the local hotel gets hacked. This creates a legal shelter. Umbrella brands extract maximum data value, franchise fees, and consumer trust via technical infrastructure, while utilizing the law's focus on physical collection to offload liability onto local operators. To solve this API loophole, the DPDPA framework introduces a new juristic concept, the Super Data Fiduciary. This definition ignores who physically touches the keyboard. Instead, it aims the legal lens at who wields structural power and control over the network. The best way to visualize this control is through biology. The local franchisee is a nerve ending. It touches the hot stove and collects the raw data input. But it doesn't decide what to do with that information. It instantly transmits the data up into the central nervous system built and operated by the overarching brand. The DPDPA definition lists 5 specific vectors that prove this centralized control: reputational, governance, policy, economic, and ecosystem. If a brand dictates the cybersecurity audits, controls the centralized payment gateways, and mandates the software ecosystem, they are in control. Let's construct this hierarchy into the fiduciary pyramid. At the wide base are the data processors and joint fiduciaries, the third-party IT vendors and financial payment gateways doing the digital grunt work. Above them sits the middle tier, the operational data fiduciaries. These are the local franchisees, front desks, and local clinics that physically interact with consumers to gather the initial information. Finally, at the apex sits the super data fiduciary. They aren't the primary collector, but they project the overarching policy downward and extract the ecosystem value upward. This architecture ensures that if a corporate entity controls the central nervous system and dictates mandatory security policies, they carry the legal weight when those policies fail at the nerve endings. While commercial franchises illustrate the commercial need for this concept, we can stress test the fiduciary pyramid by applying it to an even more structurally embedded sector, higher education. This structural map of a massive public university system is a clear manifestation of the pyramid. The overarching university sits at the top. Below it are the individual colleges, which are further divided into highly autonomous departments, handling admissions, examinations, the library, and sports. Over a 4-year degree, these decentralized departments act as independent operational fiduciaries. They track your attendance, your psychological evaluations, your reading habits, and your physical biometrics, generating a massive, highly sensitive, and permanent data profile. Yet there is a profound disconnect. You spend years handing intimate details to local autonomous departments, but your final degree, the public-facing result of your education, carries only the overarching reputational branding of the university. Consider a plausible scenario. A local college sports department uses an outdated, unpatched server to store student-athlete medical records, resulting in a decade of biometric data leaking onto the dark web. Under the strict binary definitions of the current DPDPA, the overarching university would attempt to isolate itself. Their legal team would argue that the local sports department declared the specific purpose and collected the records, making them the sole fiduciary. Applying the DPDPA framework to education is vital because it forces the university, which reaps the reputational prestige, to mandate and enforce a unified, secure data ecosystem across every autonomous department. However, conceptual frameworks are only useful if they survive an actual courtroom, and enforcing this new accountability hits a massive pre-existing legal roadblock, the constitutional loophole known as the instrumentality of state. Because public universities operate under the direct governance and funding of state governments, they are frequently granted sweeping constitutional and administrative liability exemptions designed to protect state operations. This raises a critical, currently moot, legal question. Does this massive umbrella of state immunity trickle all the way down the pyramid, shielding those subordinate local departments from data breach lawsuits? The root of this problem lies in judicial history. The current Supreme Court interpretations defining an instrumentality of state were designed decades ago to adjudicate entirely different issues, like whether a university janitor is technically a government employee, or how to handle physical labor disputes. Attempting to use a legal test built for 20th century pension payouts to determine 21st century API sovereignty and digital cybersecurity liability is a profound category error. This leaves us with a difficult paradox. If we successfully implement the super fiduciary framework to hold billion-dollar umbrella brands accountable, will it force them to build more secure networks? Or will it incentivize these massive corporations to hire lawyers to write more ironclad contracts that further sever them from their affiliates? Until the courts update these constitutional precedents to match the reality of decentralized digital architecture, the corporate shell game will persist, and your personal data will remain trapped in a legal vacuum, protected by a brand name that, on paper, has no responsibility for its security.